everyone. Welcome to the September 24th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined in just a second by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at a few stakes races from Parx, Belmont, Churchill. They ran some Breeders' Cup preps there. Obviously, the focus is Pennsylvania Derby Day at Parx, where they also ran the Cotillion. Some of the top 3-year-olds in the country were in action in those races. We'll go through those events, discuss the Kelso from Belmont, as well as Kofepi's performance in the Dogwood from Churchill. And then at the end of the show, we'll touch on a few minor stakes from Laurel, Charlestown, and Monmouth. This is our second week of doing 2 podcasts in a week. We recorded our first episode of the TimeformUS Forecast last Friday, where we talked about some of these races before they were run and put out our pre-race opinions. And Craig, I think we actually did okay. We didn't embarrass ourselves the first week.
No, not at all. Some races worked out pretty well. Others were head scratchers, I think, for most people, not just for us. So looking forward to talking about all of them.
And we're going to begin with one of those head scratchers. I don't think a whole lot of people first saw Math Wizard winning the Pennsylvania Derby. It looked like a 3-horse race coming in, with the big 3 being Mr. Money, Improbable, and War of Will, sort of to a lesser degree. But Math Wizard didn't really get the pace set up. Never really looked like he was in a great position to win the race, given the early pace of the race. But he just ran them down in the stretch. And I think it really calls into question the overall quality of this race. I know that we are 2 people who have kind of been saying that this 3-year-old class isn't as bad as a lot of people have been kind of making them out to be. This was not a great example of one of their shining moments, I guess.
No, it wasn't. And to be fair, I mean, the best horse, the horse we probably thought was the best of this group, at least, scratched out of the race in Maximum Security. And I think he's done for the year. So you were left with some horses who probably are a cut below maybe the horses we're saying, with the good crop horses like Code of Honor and Tacitus and maybe a couple others. But I did find it a disappointing effort. The pace was slow, as you mentioned. It's not slow enough in our PPs to be coded in blue as slow pace, but at best, I would say it was a moderate pace. Improbable, obviously, isn't over his gait issues. That clearly doomed him. His head was completely turned sideways at the start. He came out a few lengths behind. He did get into the race pretty quickly thereafter, but I don't think there's any doubt the start cost him at least a position, maybe 2, maybe 3. Who knows? It obviously wasn't ideal. So, as you say, just a disappointing race. Math Wizard, he did run a 1:23. He had run a nice TimeformUS speed figure. I think it was 3 races back at maybe the Ohio Derby when he was second to Owendale. But he disappointed a couple times since, was finally given a little more time than he had been and ran well. The one question I have for you, I really need to go back and watch the races again from Parx and watch all of them. But I'm not sure the inside was the place to be, and I'm wondering if maybe Math Wizard just out-tripped everybody by getting to the outside part of the track.
It's something that I was thinking about as I was rewatching these races again, because not only was Improbable compromised at the start, but I know Mike Smith isn't riding at Parx day in and day out, but just on any given day at Parx, the last thing that you want to do is angle down towards the rail coming to the top of the stretch, because so often the rail is not the place to be, especially on the stretch at Parx. And I just didn't quite get that move with Improbable, just hugging the rail the entire way around the far turn and then trying to go inside of horses at the top of the stretch as Math Wizard was angling outside. I don't know if that cost Improbable a top 3 finish or cost him the win even, but all of those factors together, I do think Improbable probably could have done better here. It's hard to say. We'll discuss another race later on, the Parx Dirt Mile, that did have a very inside flow to it. So I'm not really sure. And perhaps the track was just changing throughout the day in Parx. That's possible too, although I'm not sure that the times really corroborate that. We'll touch upon that as well. But yeah, it was a difficult call for me. Overall, I thought it was probably pretty fair. To me, the big disappointment of this race was Mr. Money, because he's the one that was kind of exposed as being just sort of a grade 2, grade 3 type, in my opinion. He'd been beating up on some weaker foes, as we discussed last week. And this was really his chance to to step up and run a faster speed figure without improbable braking. He had a very favorable setup on the front end. I actually think Gabriel Saez probably could have been a little bit more aggressive with him, because it seemed as if he almost didn't realize that improbable hadn't broken, because he almost looked really reluctant to let this horse go to the lead past the wire the first time. When you see improbable knock him out of the gate, that should be the place that you want to go to let this horse relax on the lead. And it just seemed like he was rating this horse a bit too aggressively in the early portion of the race, because you compare the pace of this race to the Cotillion, which we'll get to next. And if you would run these races on top of each other, these Pennsylvania Derby horses might have been 20 lengths off the pace set by Jaywalk and the Cotillion, which is just pretty ridiculous.
It is. I agree with you. You know, I talk about it all the time, especially on dirt, but even on turf. I just don't understand kind of the rating on some of these horses sometimes. I think with a speed horse, you want to get, now I'm not talking about run off and open up a 10-length lead, but you shouldn't be content to lead by a half a length or a length. You know, put some space in between yourself and the pursuers. An open lead is when you often get your best performances. So I don't understand keeping horses in the race like a math wizard. And even Improbable was kind of kept in the race by the pace and probably finished a lot closer than he would have had they actually let Mr. Money go. But I think it's just a reality of racing this year that jockeys ride races differently. They're not as aggressive as they used to be. Maybe part of that is particularly at the top levels, we have just so much turf racing these days where speed is not the weapon that it is on dirt. It clearly is still a weapon. We see it all the time, but it's not the same on dirt. You definitely have to use something for the finish, and maybe it's just carrying over to the dirt races. I don't really know the answer, but a horse like Mr. Money, I would have let him roll. I'd have let him throw a 47 up there as opposed to a 49 and see if they could catch him. Not only do you open up some space, you also sap the kick of the closers, which clearly didn't happen here.
Yeah, when you're on Mr. Money, you're not supposed to be putting the horse in a situation where he's just a length and a half ahead of a closer like Math Wizard at the quarter pole. That just gives Math Wizard the advantage. And I know it's maybe it sounds counterintuitive to say that a slow pace helped a closer, and I don't think we're saying that. It just brings them into the race, and it puts Mr. Money in a position where he has to basically sprint a quarter mile like it was a turf race at the end of the race. And that's just not the way you're supposed to ride a speed horse, because sprinting home, that's not really their game. It's showing their speed early on. And you could see from just the way Mr. Money was fighting his rider in the first quarter mile, he resented those tactics. So, and I know people will say, let's get to the next race as we transition to the Cotillion, that the Cotillion is evidence that a fast pace actually hurts front runners. And let's understand, this is not a black and white situation. These are two extreme ends of the spectrum, and there's a middle ground. You don't have to go as fast as Jaywalk went in the Cotillion to be letting a horse roll on the front end. He could have run 4 lengths faster, 5 lengths faster on Mr. Money, and it would have been still a moderate pace, but he would have had that advantage that we were talking about. And speaking of the Cotillion pace, I mean, this is one of the most extreme pace situations we've seen in a two-turn dirt race all year, at least in a Grade 1 event, because they were really rolling up front. I know there was a lot of pace on paper, but they sent these horses.
Yeah, this was a race we talked about on the forecast, and even though we didn't have it coded, I don't believe as being a fast pace. I think we both kind of predicted it with Jaywalk being outside and I can't believe I'm forgetting the Oaks winners. And Serengeti Empress being down inside, that these two were going to hook up. And Serengeti Empress, to the rider's credit, actually tried to take back a little bit, I think, realizing it was too fast. But by that point, it just didn't matter. I believe the opening pace figure for this race was a 180, which I'm going to have to look that up. That is pretty insane for a race of this distance. You don't see that very often. I will check that out and put something on Twitter about it. But it was just way over the top, and it wound up setting things up for Street Band, who I think we both liked somewhat. I think it might even been your top choice, who wound up going off at 7-1. And then she got a 124 TimeformUS speed figure, by far the best of her career. Somewhat pace aided, but a really good effort by her and a really good ride by Sophie Doyle. And then we had Guarana, who ran second and actually got a slightly higher figure at 125. She was actually up fairly close to that pace, just 2 lengths back after a half mile. And I thought she ran really well. She kind of proved that her acorn is more representative of her ability than we saw last time out.
Yeah, I think we did pretty well predicting how this race is going to be run on the forecast last week. Because even you mentioned Horologist as a horse that could take advantage of the pace situation, and she finished third and completed a pretty nice trifecta in this race for those three horses that we both liked a little bit. And Street Band, I got to give a ton of credit to Sophie Doyle, who I just thought read the pace situation so well. Street Band is typically not a horse that comes from as far back as she was in this race. She was actually last heading into the clubhouse turn, and she didn't break that great. That compromised her a little bit at the start, but Sophie Doyle didn't panic after that. She just let this horse settle towards the back of the pack because Street Band is one that can get a little rank in the early going. And she just got her to settle in behind horses. I thought she started moving into the race pretty early, and that's what you wanted to do in this situation because there are plenty of just also rans in this race that were going to be dropping out pretty soon. And she got past those horses pretty early on the backstretch. And just coming around the far turn, the Street Band took her right into the race, and you could tell coming to the quarter pole that she wasn't going to lose this race. To Guarana's credit, I thought Guarana really fought on pretty gamely in the final eighth of a mile, especially. She was trying to pull away from the rest of the field. She was holding Horologist at bay, who had more momentum built up than her at the top of the stretch. And Guarana finished well ahead of all of the other horses that were anywhere near that pace in the early going. So I thought she ran quite well. But Street Band is just that typical kind of horse that's really improving in the second half of the season. And credit to Larry Jones, who I know hasn't had a really top filly in a number of years now. But given the speed figure that she ran here, she's got to be considered a major contender moving on to the Breeders' Cup.
Yeah, I would think so. And as you said, this was a strong race. I'm not sure what they're going to do with all the horses. You got to wonder about Jaywalk and Serengeti Empress. Do you keep going long, or do you turn them back to a sprint? Perhaps the 7 furlong filly and mare Turf could be a target, although Kofefi, who we'll talk about, might make that point moot. But just a really strong race. I do want to point out, as you said, some people will say, well, look at the fast pace. This is what happens. But this was really extreme. The riders got a little bit crazy up front and just went way, way too fast. You won't often see even on our figures where we account for pace, a horse like Guarana, who was beat by over 2 lengths in a route race, get a better figure than the winner. But she did here, albeit by just a point. But I just thought it was a strong race. Even Bellafina, I thought, ran pretty good. She didn't totally pack it in. Showed maybe she's finally getting back to the form she had as a 2-year-old. It was her best race in quite a while, in my opinion.
Yeah, I thought so too. Bellafina sort of took that race over once Serengeti Empress and Jaywalk were pretty much finished coming to the top of the stretch. And she faded at the end of the race, but I think that was understandable given how the pace set up. And I thought this was a step in the right direction for her. I just want to say, I can't remember a year recently where we've had this many 3-year-old fillies running speed figures in the mid to high 120s, actually. Now Street Band joins that club, but already we had seen Guarana, Serengeti Empress, and Kofefi. I don't know if I'm forgetting some others, but it's turning out that this is a pretty fast group of 3-year-old fillies, and it just didn't seem like that would be the case early in the year.
No, it sure didn't. They've definitely developed. I remember heading into the Oaks. I mean, it looked like a really weak crop, especially routing. Sprinting was, a little bit better, but the routers hadn't run very good figures. Serengeti Empress won the Oaks with a not great figure, but since then we've really seen kind of an explosion, and you just never know. As I've said often on here with 3-year-olds, they tend to get better as the year goes on, and these fillies have really taken a jump. And at this point, I'm not sure that they, especially a horse like Street Band or Guarana couldn't, race competitively with a Midnight Bisou and an Elite.
Yeah, I think some people are going into the Breeders' Cup thinking that Midnight Bisou and Elite have some gigantic speed figure edge on this group of horses, and they are a little bit faster, but it's not like they're earning figures in the mid 130s or even the low 130s. They're a little bit faster, and these 3-year-olds are obviously improving right now. So I think that's going to be a fun race. These horses like Street Band and Guarana probably have a little bit more of improving to do to really get on terms with those older fillies. But I don't think there's as big of a gap between them as a lot of people are making it out to be. Moving on to the other major 3-year-old race run at Parx on Saturday, the Gallant Bob Grade 2 event for the 3-year-olds going 6 furlongs. And this is one where I know you want to talk about the speed figure a little bit, because a lot of people were, I think, expecting this to get a bigger number from us. Obviously, the two California horses, King Jack and Landeskog, just threw it down in the stretch and opened up about a dozen lengths on the rest of the field by the time they hit the wire. These two were just far superior to their rivals on this occasion. And I think they're two really nice horses, but the speed figure came back about as fast as the other two races on this card we just talked about.
Yeah, a 123 for the winner, King Jack. Landeskog got a 121. And a big part of that is because of the pace. The final time figure is actually 131, which I think you saw some people were asking about. I think the buyer speed figure was a 111. So the final time figure actually lines up with the buyer. I do get asked a lot about buyers, and I'll be honest, I very rarely even look at them. If I happen to see them on the Twitter feed, of course, I'm going to take note, but I don't really seek them out. I don't want any, if he does the figure before me, I don't want to be influenced when I do mine. And so, yeah, no knock on Buyer. I mean, I look up to him. I think he's a great guy for the game, but I just don't look at his figures very often. But when I do get asked, I'll go look. And in this case, we actually agreed. It just comes down to the pace. And this race lined up with all the others, other than the first, which was a total aberration and was kind of, I definitely rated that one separately than all the others. But the rest lined up well, particularly when we accounted for the pace. You may look at the raw fractions and go, well, that doesn't look like a slow pace. But for Parx and for that particular final time, slow, when I say slow, it's relative. That was a slow half mile for that final time at Parx. You can look at some of the fractions and the other sprints on the card, and you'll see what I was talking about. There was a race run later at a longer distance. I think that actually had a faster opening half mile fraction. So there's nothing wrong with a 123 or a 121. These both horses that both run 119 coming in. We knocked down that 131 final time for a reason, and it actually works out pretty well going forward. I wouldn't want to bet either of these horses like they were going to run 130 or 128 Timeform US speed figures next time they show up.
And just in case people are doubting that the pace of this race was not a fast one, because I think people look at the raw times and see 21-4, 44-3, and say, well, how is that not a fast pace? Well, just look at the race flow. I mean, the two horses that were right on top of the pace basically sprinted home from a visual perspective and opened up a dozen lengths on the rest of the field, while none of the closers were able to get into the race. Now, maybe the closers just were long shots and weren't ever going to get into the race, but it didn't play out like a race where the speeds were compromised at all, quite the opposite. So sometimes the fractions can be a little bit misleading in these situations. And as you were saying, when you look at the just how the races played out throughout the day at Parx, you didn't see horses coming home particularly fast, especially in the sprint races. So the fact that these horses came home in, 24-1, based on how the track was playing that day, that actually is a pretty fast come home time. So that's why the figures worked out this way. And I'm somebody who looks at the buyers just as much as I look at the Timeform US speed figures. I think for me, just from a handicapping perspective, they both have a lot of value. And when I'm comparing the two, I compare the buyer number to the final Timeform figure, Timeform US figure, which is the 131 in this case, not the Timeform US speed figure, which is the 123, because that's after we make the pace adjustment. And it just doesn't, you can't compare it and make that 20-point difference work all the time. Whereas when you're just looking at the final time figure, that's where you can make the comparison. And that's not to say that you always should have a perfect 20-point difference between the buyer and the Timeform US final time figure, because sometimes different decisions are made along the way. But just when you're seeing if the two speed figures line up, that's what you'd compare it to.
Right, no doubt. That's definitely, buyer is a final time figure. And I think he'd be the first to tell you that where we don't often break races out because of the pace, he's forced to do it sometimes because he is strictly a one-dimensional figure, as say. But at times you almost have to take the pace into account. And even with our figures, we still have to even break it out further when the pace is really extreme, particularly on the slow end. So it is an interesting comparison. And I really don't mind. I joke with people sometimes, but I don't mind people asking me about buyer speed figures. I know a ton about them. I mean, I started out making my own for years in the same method, following buyers' books, and just kind of went on from there. But I mean, not that it would ever happen, but if the buyer team ever asked, needed an associate, I could step in and do that job easily. I mean, I'm very familiar with them.
And speaking of speed figures, I thought it was kind of funny that the 4 races at Parx for us got speed figures that were all within a point of each other, and that continued in the other major dirt stakes they ran on Saturday, the Parx Dirt Mile. This was a non-graded event. I think this is actually a new race that they ran this year. And Coal Front got a 124, the same figure that Streetbound got winning the cotillion. Obviously, this race was a little bit shorter, going a mile. I don't think this was the strongest field. Nice to see Coal Front get back on track after a couple of disappointing efforts following that Godolphin Mile win back in the springtime. And now that I'm looking at the chart of this race, I wonder if Mike Smith was thinking that maybe the rail wasn't so bad because he rode Coal Front to victory in this race, riding the rail almost the entire way. And he sort of put Improbable down in that same path in the Pennsylvania Derby for whatever that's worth. But
Coal Front, go ahead. Sorry.
Coal Front got the job done here, setting the pace the entire way, a moderate pace. But the horse he was holding off, Diamond King, it's just sort of a grade 3 type.
Yeah, I was going to say I wouldn't. It was a weak race, and if this was a grade 2 race, I would say it was weak, but it's not. It's a listed stakes race, so a 124 for the winner and a 123 for Diamond King is actually pretty strong for a listed race. I mean, these horses could probably be competitive in grade 2, grade 3 type races, depending on the field they drew. But then it was a pretty big gap to the others. It was good to see Coal Front kind of get back to form. He had won that nice race in Dubai, was a little over his head at Belmont for the Met Mile, and then really disappointed last time out. I think it was at Monmouth where he was a bad third at odds on, if memory serves. But this was a good effort. I imagine they'll throw him into a tougher spot next time, and depending who shows up, he could be competitive.
I'd agree with that. I imagine we'll go on to the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile with him, and we'll see how he does there. And we'll also see how some of the horses out of the Kelso do. We'll talk about that race in a little bit. But moving on to Belmont Park and some of the stakes races that they ran there this weekend. I'm not sure if these are really Breeders' Cup preps. Probably the last race we'll talk about from Belmont definitely is. We'll see more of those Breeders' Cup preps from New York the next couple of weeks. But the Noble Damsel went as the 8th race on Saturday, a grade 3 event going a mile for the fillies and mares on the turf. And I'm not sure that there really is a Breeders' Cup race for significant form, and she probably isn't quite at that level anyway. I will say that it seems like she's finally found her niche as a miler in these grade 2 and grade 3 races. She's just taken a step forward this year, I think, finally. Earlier in the year, it seemed like maybe she was just as good as she was as a 3-year-old and hadn't really taken that step forward. But her last couple of starts, I liked her effort in the Ballston Spa. And this day, she was just utterly dominant over her foes in this Noble Damsel.
Yeah, this is a race where I would say 6-5 was an overlay, and I would have said that before the race. She just looked like much the best horse coming in, and she proved it. She won with a 118 speed figure from us. I think she probably could have done better if really asked. I mean, she just had this field over a barrel. I'm glad to see hopefully the sprinting days are over with her. As you said, I think this is her best distance right at the mile and a 16th. And just a solid effort. We didn't talk about this race, I think, because of her dominance, really. There wasn't a whole lot to say here. But, as you say, I don't think any of these are grade 1 fillies at that point. They just kind of are what they are, grade 2, grade 3 types. And I'm sure she's going to win a lot of money for her connections as long as they place her in the right spots, which usually isn't an issue for Chad Brown. He tends to find the right spots to put his horses in.
Yeah, the disappointment of this race, I think, was Valedictorian, who just couldn't quite run her typical high 118, 119 speed figure here. She had the kind of pace setup that she wanted, setting a moderate pace, and seems like maybe she's just finally tailing off a little bit at the end of what's been a pretty long, hard campaign for her. And with her not running her A race, it really was just significant forms race to lose. And she ran as well as she needed to run to win this race impressively. And I would assume a race like the Matriarch would probably be on the radar for Chad Brown. That's a grade 1 event at the end of the year, going a mile. She doesn't seem like a Breeders' Cup horse, so I imagine they'd go for a race like that, and that might be an opportunity for her to get a valuable grade 1 victory. But just seems like she's finally hitting her stride now as of the end of her 4-year-old season.
Yeah, I'd say as far you mentioned valedictorian, she kind of reminded me of Escape Cause, who is a filly that we've just talked about countless times this year because she runs so often. And I think she showed some signs, as had Escape Cause last week, just being a bit over the top and probably needs a rest. I mean, I love for horses to run like her as much as they do, but when they start tailing off, I think it's maybe time to regroup with her. And she just didn't look like the same horse at all that we've seen the rest of this year.
Yeah, I agree with that. Moving on to the feature race from Saturday at Belmont, that was the Grade 2 Kelso, prep for the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. And the New York bred, pat on the back, got the victory here. I believe this was his first stakes win against Open Company, although he had been very good in New York bred races for a long time, running the kinds of speed figures that would make him competitive in these Open Company races. He finally broke through and got that victory here. And I thought he just ran a really nice race. Dylan Davis, I think, corrected the mistake that he made last time that he got a lot of criticism for when he was a little too aggressive with this horse going the 6 furlongs at Saratoga, kind of sending him down to a bad rail. We talked about that on the forecast last week. And he put him in behind horses this day, swung him out at the top of the stretch, and just ran down a pretty game Prince Lucky. I thought both of the top two finishers ran really well in this race.
Yeah, I did as well. And even True Timber, I thought, ran pretty well coming off that Dubai layoff. So I'd say even the top three. Pat on the back ran a 124 speed figure. Prince Lucky actually got a 125, being up a little closer to a solid piece. It's not coated red or anything. Certainly wasn't fast, but it was just a solid piece. It was pretty bunched up at the top, which maybe set it up for Pat on the back. He just kind of sat behind the top three and was able to kick out clear around him in the stretch, but he had to fight for it. Prince Lucky really dug in, and I think he showed he's in good form. I was against him in this spot, but he ran better than I thought he would. We talked about him being kind of an in and out horse, but he was definitely in on this day and just got beat by a horse that ran a little bit better, but nothing bad in defeat. And as I said, True Timber hung on for third after being part of that quick, and not so much quick, but contested pace, which often is just as important as how fast the pace is. And, the top three all ran pretty good for my eye.
I'll admit I haven't seen any information about whether any of these horses are targeting the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. I didn't see that in any of the post-race quotes about Pat on the back. And he's a horse that I would imagine has a lot of options because he's a New York bred. If they want to set their sights lower, they could run in the Empire Classic again. They could point for the Cigar Mile later in the year. So I don't know if they plan on going to the Breeders' Cup with him. I haven't seen that. Or for Prince Lucky, I'm not sure. The Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile is one of those fields that seems to come together at the last minute because it's almost like a consolation prize for a lot of horses. It's not really a dirt mile division per se. No, I thought both of the top two ran well and they could potentially be competitive in a race like that. Just depends on how the field comes up.
Yeah, and of course, we got to keep in mind it's in Santa Anita this year, so it'll be a two-turn race. Not sure how that's going to affect some of these. They've mostly had their success around one turn, I believe. So it should be interesting. Like you said, you just got to keep an eye out for the field because you get horses who maybe 6 furlongs is too short or their connections don't think they're good enough or can run a mile and a quarter for the Classic. So it's a field that's usually pretty fluid until the week of the race, and you just have to wait and see who's going to show up.
There were a couple, or actually I think about 3 stakes races on Sunday at Belmont. We'll talk about a couple of them. There were 2 New York bred turf stakes for the older runners, and the male version of this race, the Ashley T. Cole, just love to talk about these older New York bred turf horses because they're a really good group. It seems like every season they just keep taking turns beating each other, and lately we've seen some of them go into Open Company and do pretty well. That was certainly the case for Voodoo Song and Gucci Factor, who both ran in this race, and Dot Matrix, who I don't think he had won one of these races before, but he got the job done here. He had been second to Offering Plan in the West Point previously at Saratoga and turned the tables on that foe this time. I think the ride that Luis Saez gave this horse really made the difference because we talked about it on the forecast last week. Voodoo Song just looked like he was totally clear on the front end, and that proved to be the case. But the horse that was in closest pursuit of him early was Dot Matrix, and he was just the one that was in position to take over when Voodoo Song couldn't quite see it out at the end.
Yeah, he ran good. Two things really surprised me in this race. Voodoo Song ran much better than I thought. He hadn't looked very good this year, but I think the tote board kind of told the tale. Looking at this race, I never thought he'd be 3-1. But Linda Rice, I guess she knew what he was doing. He looked to be back in tight top form. The other surprise to me was Dot Matrix being 8-1. I really didn't expect that. I thought the race was going to come down to him and Offering Plan and Gucci Factor, but he kind of got ignored in the wagering. And as you said, he sat that garden spot just kind of waiting on Voodoo Song to get tired, which he eventually did. I wouldn't even say tired. He just was able to run him down. Voodoo Song held second, and Offering Plan came running, but it was just too late. These two had to jump on him and were able to hold him off.
Yeah, I thought Voodoo Song really ran one of his better races here. He was really game at the end, which he has been when we've seen him be in form in the past. He tries really hard at the end of his races after sort of running off in the early going, and he did that here. You could say it was just a New York bred race, and maybe he's not that grade one level that he was last season when he won the 4-star Dave. But he's heading in the right direction now. We'll see if Linda Rice keeps him around or targets some races later in the fall. I think there's another New York bred race coming up that I'm forgetting the name of, that they run, the Mohawk, that they run at the end of the meet. So I imagine he'll go there next. But I thought he ran well, and I agree with you. They bet this like it was a 2-horse race between Voodoo Song and Gucci Factor. And to me, it seemed like totally wide open to about 5 or 6 horses. And I think that's the way that it played out, because even Offering Plan ran pretty well here, closing into what turned out to be a moderate pace towards the middle of the race. I know they ran what's coded as a fast first quarter that Voodoo Song set, but they slowed it down in the middle, and it was really dominated by the top 2 runners early on. So I thought Offering Plan ran well. Obviously, Gucci Factor just completely acted up at the start and just caused a lot of problems for himself and was off slowly, and that really cost him any chance in this race, which was unfortunate. He actually didn't even run that badly to be 6th at the closing at the end. But I agree with you. Dot Matrix was an overlay, and he ran pretty well.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention the speed figures. He got a 119, which he had run a 118 when second last time, the Offering Plan. Voodoo Song actually got a 120, setting that fast pace. So pretty strong New York bred race. I wouldn't say any of them are ready to jump into graded stakes, but as you said, this is always a fun division. It's always deep. These aren't horses that are going to be retired anytime soon. So we're just going to see them run. They get to run for a lot of money, and they don't have a lot of other spots to go. So they are just going to keep facing each other over and over, and they're really fun races as handicappers to analyze trips and see who maybe was hindered and who was helped, and you constantly are going to get to try to prove whether you were right or not, because they're just going to keep running back against each other over and over.
That Breeders' Cup prep that I mentioned that was run at Belmont this past weekend was the Grade 2 Gallant Bloom, run earlier in the day on Sunday, and really this was just sort of a paid workout for the 1 to 5 favorite Come Dancing, and she didn't disappoint in that she won impressively, off by 3 1/4 lengths over Minute to Stardom, who's a good horse. But I think there are some things to discuss about Come Dancing. She's displayed some bad habits now in really 4 straight races, because she's broken badly 4 times in a row, dating all the way back to when she won the Ruffian and the Slop in the spring. She broke a length slowly that day. She stumbled at the start of the Ogden Phipps. She broke a length slowly in the Ballerina, and she broke a length slowly in this race on Sunday. It didn't really matter because she's just so much superior to these horses, but she started to show some bad tendencies. Even in the lane, she was lugging in pretty drastically at the end of this race. Just not things you want to see from a horse who's going to be among the favorites in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint if she ends up there next.
Yeah, it was kind of an ugly race from her. I mean, she ran a acceptable speed figure, I guess, a 116. She had run a 117 in her last win at Saratoga. So, I mean, she's doing okay, but the eye test just doesn't look good. Like you say, she's having consistent gait problems, and I really didn't like the lugging in this time. She kind of, once she got clear, just went almost straight over to the rail, and I'm just not sure what to make of her. As a short price, I'm a fan of the horse. I really like how well she's ran this year, but from a betting perspective, I'm kind of leaning going away from her. She beat basically nothing in here. I know Minute to Stardom won the Grade 2 honorable miss last time, but she didn't do it with much of a speed figure. There wasn't much else in this field, and I'm just not as high on her prospects as I was, say, much earlier in the year.
Yeah, you know that I'm one of this horse's biggest fans, and I've really liked watching her throughout the year. I agree with you, though. She's not the kind of horse that I feel like I could support in the Breeders' Cup because, I mean, it's just hard to envision her overcoming all of these bad habits and working out the right trip in what's got to be a sizable field for this race. I mean, I think the best hope would be that she draws the outside post position, breaks a length slowly, and then can just sort of seamlessly work her way into the race. But I mean, imagine if she's drawn inside and she breaks the leg slowly in a race like the Breeders' Cup. I mean, she would just be doomed from there. And I don't know if it's something they can correct at this point. She's a 6-year-old mare. I mean, it's hard to teach these horses something new at this point in their careers. You just kind of have to let them do what they do. And even Carlos Martin, after the race, I was reading the post-race quotes in Dave Grenning's article, and he was saying, you know, we don't want to see this stuff. We've worked on it previously. Maybe we'll try to work on it again between now and the Breeders' Cup. But I don't know. It's just you kind of have to throw your hands up in the air and let her do what she does. Yeah, it's a little bit disconcerting to see. I'm a fan of hers. I hope she does well. I kind of doubt I'll be betting on her in the Breeders' Cup, though, unfortunately, especially given the emergence of the horse we're going to talk about next, Kofefi, who won the dogwood at Churchill Downs on Saturday. Just an ungraded stakes race, not a strong field, very much like Come Dancing's Gallant Bloom. But she did everything right, Kofefi. Set an honest pace and just rocketed away from this field in the stretch, came close to the track record again, and she has just turned into something pretty special.
Yeah, she is. She just devastated this field, which admittedly wasn't much, but she got a 128 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. It was a 131 final time, same as King Jack, who we talked about earlier. And she just did it so easily. And what I actually like about her is she's shown that she doesn't have to be right on the lead. She kind of sat a length off the early leader here, just as she did in the test stakes. So she has that good, controllable tactical speed, that really high cruising speed. And then she's able to just finish off these races. She's probably at this point, she's almost got to be odds on for the filly and mare sprint, or at least close to it in the 14-horse field. Maybe you'll get 6-5 or 7-5. But given the way she's dominating these races, she is definitely a force to deal with, and one of the more exciting filly sprinters I can remember in quite a while.
Yeah, the only possible scenario where she's not a really strong favorite in that race, I think, would be if they decide to turn back Guarana and run her in the filly and mare sprint, given that she and Dunbar Road have the same owner and trainer. I could see them separating those two horses. I haven't seen anything about whether or not that's the plan, but I could see that. But she might be a foe to Kofefi, but everybody else that we've seen, I mean, she was able to beat Serengeti Empress in the test. I know Serengeti Empress ran her to a half-length decision that day or whatever it was, but I don't think she's going to take that much money off her dismal effort in the cotillion last week. And it just seems like Kofefi's taken that step forward. She's arguably the fastest 3-year-old of either sex in the country right now because she's the only one that's consistently run these speed figures in the mid to high 120s. And just a really nice horse. I have nothing negative to say about her. As you were saying, she can stalk the pace a little bit. She's just going to be really tough to beat in that race. And I'm looking forward to see how she runs, basically.
Yeah, it is. I'm not sure. I imagine they're not giving her a prep before the Breeders' Cup, so this is probably what we're going to have to go on. We'll see some others run in some of the prep races coming up. I would imagine they'll have one out in California, but I can't think of anyone that I would imagine could run this kind of speed figure and look like a real formidable foe that we haven't seen yet. So just exciting filly and looking forward to it. I agree. She's been the fastest. I think maybe Chancelot had that one race at Saratoga that was faster, but for the most part, she's running the most consistent fast speed figures that we've seen.
Sticking with that same division, although not quite at the level of Kofefi, were some horses contesting the Grade 3 Charlestown Oaks. Interesting race to watch. We had talked about on the forecast last week there being a lot of speed in this race, and I think it kind of played with the heads of some of the riders, especially the rider of the favorite Irish Mischief, who seemed to come out of the gate with the plan not to go to the front, and he sort of strangled her to the back of the pack, even though she appeared to be one of the speeds on paper. And Lady TNT, who was a pretty big price in this race. Her rider was one who is familiar with the Charlestown course and how it plays, and he was just the most aggressive early. He was really intent on getting to the lead with this filly, and once he got to the lead, turned out that the pace wasn't as contested as it appeared to be, and he set a pretty moderate pace and just went wire to wire.
Yeah, and like I told you, I mean, I spent a lot of time at Charlestown, and somebody taken back at Charlestown. I thought I'd seen everything, but that's a new one for me. That almost never happens there because speed is just so important with the tight turns. Obviously, this was a 2-turn race. The stretch is really short, so you really want to be out front. So it was really confusing. Luckily, I thought Irish Mischief was the best horse. We both commented on the 8-1 morning line. We knew that was never going to happen. So the 6-5 saved me here. The Linda Rice horse, the other one, we both kind of like scratched out of here, which I guess shouldn't be a surprise either. She does tend to scratch her horses quite a bit, but Lady TNT was basically handed a clear lead and ran a 1:14 TimeformUS speed figure. It's the best she had run in a while. I'm not sure exactly, or best she's ever run. I'm not sure where that race came from, but to be fair, it was her second off a layoff where she hadn't been seen since April for that. And as I talked about earlier, these are 3, and you bet them thinking they're going to run the same speed figure they ran in April, when you get into mid and late September, because if she showed any improvement, they're going to run better numbers. 37-1, I don't know that I would have ever came up with her, but it was a solid enough effort and just shows how dangerous speed can be.
Yeah, not to redboard or anything, but I did think, just looking at it afterwards, 37-1 was a little ridiculous on this horse, because it's not like Irish Mischief had the field over a barrel. I mean, she is coming out of some lesser races in Kentucky, and this was a step up in class for her. I mean, maybe it just seems like it to me because I'm a morning line maker, but it does seem like, people sometimes say that you can manipulate the odds by making a morning line. To me, the only time that ever happens is when the morning line is wrong. And it just seems like people see an 8-1 morning line and just almost go overboard on a horse, thinking that they're going to get some kind of value, and that horse ends up going off at a much lower price than it otherwise would have. I know it seems like that happens to me quite a bit when I do get things wrong. And I mean, Irish Mischief was the horse to beat, but being nearly even money in this race, and she was, I think, odds on for much of the betting, just seemed like going overboard a little bit on this horse. I agree. She ran really well. Irish Mischief was probably the best horse. I would imagine this would be one that Joe Rosario would want to do over, given that the pace didn't turn out to be that fast. He probably did not want to be that far back in the early going, and she just resented those tactics anyway. She had never run that way in the past, and she just, all things considered, ran pretty well to be second because she was closing best of all at the end. But she probably should have won this race. And Lady TNT, she had been picked up checks against some decent horses earlier in the year. Joe Sharp took the blinkers off in this race. Maybe that made a difference, but just won a race that was okay. I don't think we saw any superstars in this field.
Yeah, we're not going to see any of these in the filly and mare sprint, I wouldn't imagine. So
I would think not. We did see some good horses run at Laurel, though. Probably not Breeders' Cup level horses, but I thought these were both fun races to watch. This Baltimore-Washington International Turf Cup and the DeFrancis Dash, which we'll talk about second. In the turf race, the name of which I'm not going to say again, it was an exciting race to watch. As Caribou Club just held off Frontier Market. Before we get to the top two, though, I just want to comment on Glorious Empire, because when I looked at the results of this race before I watched, it kind of happened a little earlier in the day than I anticipated, and I missed it and went back and watched it after seeing the results, and I saw, Glorious Empire was sixth. I guess he didn't run that well. Then I went back and watched the race, and this was a pretty good prep race for Glorious Empire. He actually had the lead until mid-stretch, chasing a really fast pace set by McKagan. There's some positive things to say about Glorious Empire's performance in this race.
Yeah, I thought he ran fine. Chasing McKagan, that's never easy. We see where McKagan finished, one spot below him and dead last. He was actually my foolish pick in this race. I kind of knew deep down this isn't the kind of course he likes, but I thought his speed advantage would maybe help. But we've talked about speed horses rating, and he's one of those that you just – he's going to go as fast as he can go. And if you're good enough to catch him, you will. And if you're not, you can't. And he couldn't handle the step up in class. It was an interesting race in that we obviously have the pace code in red in most of the fractions. The top 4 horses all got 118 TimeformUS speed figures for the effort. They were all coming from various lengths behind, between 3rd and 7th. It was only a 7-horse field, I believe, and it was an exciting turf race. I don't even know what the margin was between those 4. I think it was less than a length between 1st and 5th. So while it was exciting, I don't know how, what the quality was. It's probably accurately judged as a grade 3. I think that's about how they run. So good betting race, but I'm not going to worry about any of these as we move on towards the Breeders' Cup or anything like that. And I'm sure you're not either.
No, and I doubt they're even going to the Breeders' Cup with Glorious Empire. How could they? I don't really know if he has the necessary, if he's met the requirements to even compete in a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf this year. And that seems like way too ambitious of a spot. But I was just focusing on Glorious Empire because he is the one horse in this race who had previously shown grade 1 ability. And he ran as well in this race as he's ever run going a mile. That a mile is just way too short for him, and he's proven that many times in the past. So I thought this was an encouraging effort for him. And he's likely to improve 5, 6, 7 or more points when they stretch him out to his preferred distances of a mile and 3/8, a mile and a half. Where they do that, I don't know. Maybe they'll take him to Gulfstream again. He did well in the Fort Lauderdale last year. I believe going a mile and 1/8 or a mile and 3/16. I forget the distance of that race. But he is a horse that wants to go longer. So I'd imagine they'll stretch him out and he'll do better in the future. But I agree with you, Caribou Club, Frontier Market, they're nice horses. They're just probably grade 3 types. And we'll probably see them in more races like that in the future.
Yeah, I should mention Glorious Empire in 6 actually got our best speed figure in this race with a 121. So that, despite finishing in 6, that's promising. He's not going to have to deal with a horse like McKagan as he stretches out, gets back to those preferred distances, and probably it's shown he still has that speed that he can use to get the lead at those longer routes.
One race later in the grade 3 to Francis Dash going the 6 furlongs on the dirt, Killybegs Captain, I thought got a much-deserved graded stakes victory here. He's a horse who has been in pretty good form for a while for John Terranova. Really got him to improve over the winter at Tampa. You might remember we talked about him all the way back, I think, on one of the first episodes of the Pacecast when he upset Imperial Hint in that race at Tampa Bay Downs in a performance that seemingly came out of nowhere. And he's just maintained that level of performance throughout the entire year. He picked up a 3rd-place finish in the Grade 1 Forgo last time. And just nice to see him get that graded stakes victory here. Not the toughest field in the world, but the horse that he held off, Altissimo, had run some pretty big speed figures going back to the summer in some lesser races, and he held that form together against a tougher field here.
He did, and what I like about him, he's pretty versatile. I mean, he came from a good 9 lengths back early on to win this race. I forget the name of the horse, kind of ran off at the start, who wound up finishing last. But just a good effort from him. I think we both like this horse in this spot, and he backed it up. He was able to transfer his New York form down to Maryland and just proved a little more classy than these. I mean, it's a solid group of sprinters that run at Laurel. We've talked about them before. They face each other often, but not quite to the level of Killybegs Captain. And I'm with you. I'm kind of a fan of this horse. I do remember him beating Imperial Hint. Obviously not the good Imperial Hint, one that didn't run his best that day, but he's just a solid sprinter and gives his best every time, and he's a horse you can get behind and root for. He did get a 121 for the win, I should mention, same as the runner-up in here. So solid effort, not a Breeders' Cup type horse, but he's a horse who's going to make a bit of money and always be a factor in these races.
And we had talked a little bit on the forecast last week about how the dead rail at Saratoga had really affected some of the results this summer. And I think the results of this race really show how meaningful and how significant that was, because Killybegs Captain had finished behind both He Hate Me and Bone Raison in the Tail of the Cat earlier in that meet on a day when the rail was as dead as we've seen it up there. And they just reversed the decision here. He Hate Me and Bone Raison could not muster up their best form in this race, and Killybegs Captain really improved off that disappointing effort back on August 9th. So it just shows how much the way the track was playing up at Saratoga really impacted the results of those races. And Killybegs Captain ran back to probably that 3rd place finish in the Forgo last time.
Yeah, those that dead rail. I mean, handicappers complain about it, but it's really our best friend if you track it and follow these. I like to use the notes that we can put in our chart, and they show up again when horses run back in the PPs. That the rail wasn't bad, and I particularly do it for horses that didn't run well when they were stuck down on the rail, so or that maybe did run better than they looked when they were stuck down on the rail, and it really pays off. So while biases maybe they're not fun during that day when you're trying to figure out who's going to be where, they certainly can pay dividends in the future.
One more race to talk about this week, the Smoke Glacken for the 2-year-olds from Monmouth. Just a $75,000 stakes, but actually to a pretty strong field for a low-level stakes race at Monmouth Park, because I forget if we had talked about this horse's debut on a previous episode of the Pacecast. I know I had watched it. I forget if we talked about it. But Meru had run pretty fast in his July 13th debut, going 5 furlongs at Monmouth. And he came into this Smoke Glacken as a prohibitive favorite and just took another step forward here. And he was beating a pretty good field because the second place finisher, as seen on TV for Kelly Breen, had also run pretty fast in his own debut. So I thought this was a pretty strong race for Monmouth.
This was one when I made the figures. I kind of had to do some double checks and make sure I wasn't missing anything. Because, had this race been rated, if it was the only race run on the day based on the figures the horses would have run, it would have came back slower, no doubt. But there were plenty of dirt races at Monmouth, both before and after. The day was really consistent. And the more I looked at it, it was just a really fast race. 114 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. He won very easy. The final time was actually a 117. And he's a horse, he surprised some people in his debut. I think he was only 9-2, and he won really easy. But the runner-up in that race has come back to win twice, including a stakes at Colonial. Now, they were turf races that the runner-up won, but it's proven to be a strong race. And this looks like a really promising colt. I haven't looked into his breeding to see if he's a horse that wants to go long. He certainly rated pretty well on the lead. He finished his race really strong, but at the very least, they got a really quick sprinter in him and just very promising. We haven't seen many 114s from 2-year-olds this time of year outside of horses not named Dennis's Moment.
Yeah, I don't know if this horse is one that's going to want to go longer. There is obviously some precocity in that pedigree, being by Sky Mesa out of an elusive quality mare. But the dam is a half to actually a sister to the dam by Sky Mesa, Skylighter, who won the Indiana Oaks for Godolphin a number of years ago. So there is a little bit of route pedigree on the dam side, but he's obviously a fast sprinter, Meru, and I think there'll be plenty of opportunities for him sprinting, especially over the winter if they go to Gulfstream with him, as this stable often does. So he's an exciting one to watch out for, as is the runner-up as seen on TV for Kelly Breen. He only won his debut by a head, going 6 furlongs towards the end of August, but he beat what seemed like a pretty good Chad Brown horse that day, Perjury Trap, and I think both of those horses have some ability. So could be a good group coming out of this Smoke Glacken at Monmouth. I'll be interested to see where they go from here. That's all the stakes racing from this past weekend. Obviously, on the next couple of shows, we'll be discussing a lot more of these Breeders' Cup preps. I believe next week in New York, they're running the Jockey Club Gold Cup in the Vosburg, and there's also the Awesome Again being run out at Santa Anita. So a lot more to discuss as we move on towards the Breeders' Cup, and we'll be recapping all of those races, and we'll be handicapping some of those races again on the TimeformUS Forecast podcast, which will be filming on Friday once again. So look out for that and another recap episode next Tuesday. We'll continue that 2-week schedule for the foreseeable future. So thanks again for listening, guys. As always, you can listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just subscribe to the Daily Racing Form and listen to the TimeformUS Pacecast and the TimeformUS Forecast. So thanks for tuning in this week, and we'll be back at you on Friday.